This is Better Together. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 2. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by Jay Dice. Episode 10. Chapter 18. Kayla had grabbed Harper's hair. Shock, followed immediately by anger, surged through her. She hadn't had siblings growing up, and she'd never really played chicken before, but the unwritten rules must clearly state no hair-pulling. The professor in her wanted to stop the action and point out that Kayla was cheating. Wyatt surged under her, backing and twisting to help her balance. Harper caught herself, tried to ignore the burning in her head, and channeled the adrenaline from her anger into fending off Marie's attack. It worked, since Carlos, seeing that they were reeling back, had overcommitted to charging forward. Not expecting them to recover so quickly, he and Marie were caught unprepared for their rush. She gripped Marie's forearms, Wyatt twisted under her, and she yanked, moving her whole upper body. Marie tumbled into the water with a large splash. Marie's body hadn't completely disappeared when another white-hot pain seared her scalp. Her whole body fell backward, seeking to ease the tension and lessen the pain. Harper used the backward momentum of her body to twist. She threw her arms out, catching Kayla and hooking onto her to check her fall. Beneath her, Wyatt seemed to sense what was playing out, because he lunged forward. Their combined attack made it impossible for Kayla to stop her momentum. Wyatt splashed water up into Steve's eyes, and he was unable to hold to Kayla's legs as she toppled sideways. "Woohoo! We won!" Wyatt said before he ducked below the surface, allowing Harper to slide off his shoulders and into the warm water. Wyatt's hand slid along her arm, and she grabbed his hand before re-emerging into the chilly night air. Wyatt paddled beside her to the edge of the pool. They sat on the ledge together. "You can't quit now. I've got a title to reclaim," Steve said.
"No, I've got water up my nose and in my eyes, and I just want to sit down for a bit,"
Marie said from the end of the pool. "Yeah, we should have known Wyatt would win." Steve treaded water in the middle of the pool.
"We could pair him with a 2-year-old and he'd still win."
Kayla hung on the ledge on the far side of the pool. Harper wasn't athletic. She knew that. She really didn't think they meant to insult her either. But their comments did serve to remind her that Wyatt and she were not on the same level here in Chile, or any time he was with his friends. "Seems to me the last time we did this, Kayla, Steve and Marie beat you and me."
"That was a fluke,"
Kayla said. "Twice." Wyatt grinned up at Harper. She thought he winked, but couldn't be sure in the moonlight. "It was 3 times, Steve said. "Kayla was pouting so badly by that last time, it wouldn't have mattered if she had been on Superman's shoulders. When you get mad, you play stupid."
"I'm out of here,"
Kayla said, moving to the edge and coming out of the water with a splash.
"Yeah, I've got to work tomorrow."
Marie rose from the water and pulled herself out of the pool. "Me too." Carlos glided over and got out behind Marie. "Hang here for a second, Pickles. I'll get our towels." "Ooh, look at Romeo getting the girl's towel." Steve picked himself out of the water and followed the others over.
"Let him alone. I think it's great that he'll get her towel,"
Marie said, grabbing her own.
"Hurry up, champ. Get the girl dried off. We'll race you home."
Kayla shook her towel and bent her head, toweling her hair. "How about it, Harper? You up for a race?" Carlos asked.
"Sure."
She wasn't, not really, but there was no way she'd admit it. She took the towel Wyatt handed her, moving quickly to dry off and dress. If there was a race, she didn't want to be the cause of them starting last. "That's one race you won't win, Wyatt. Not with two people on your sled." Steve flipped his towel behind him and swiped back and forth, drying his back. "You're right. How much of a head start is fair?" Wyatt asked. 5 minutes, Carlos called. Her swimsuit wasn't dry, but everyone else was getting dressed. Harper pulled on her snow pants. The others chattered in the background as Wyatt leaned over. "You okay with that?" Her stomach had knotted up again, but she ignored it.
As long as I get to ride with you.
She pulled her shirt on and tried to continue faking calmness.
Wasn't it you that said you hadn't saved me all those other times just to let me die now?
He laughed. "Well, it could get intense. Are you sure you're okay?"
So you're saying once we start, you're racing to win?
Of course he was. He was a competitor, after all. He shuffled his feet and stuck his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, I can't turn 'em down. No problem because there are two of us. But once we commit, I don't want to back down."
Is that your stubborn streak coming out again?
She teased. His smile was self-effacing. "Like with the whole prenup deal?"
Yeah. So once you commit to being married, even for pretend, you're not planning it out. You're all in.
"Yep, all in." Harper pulled her boots on, slanting a glance at the rest of the group. They were almost dressed.
I'm jumping in too.
Wyatt bent even closer and spoke low. "Are you sure?"
I'm sure,
Harper said. Wyatt pulled his ski hat down over his head and handed her hers. "Give us a 5-minute head start." "We came together," Carlos said of Marie and him. "So we'll leave with you." "Fair enough," Wyatt said. He buckled Harper's helmet, brushing her hands aside, then his own. Harper held his gloves out to him. Her insides were buzzing. Nervousness or excitement, she wasn't sure which. He climbed on, looking at her as she climbed on after him, before turning to stare straight ahead and flipping his visor down. Flicking his fingers, the motor roared to life. They idled past the first two snowmobiles, leaving the hot spring behind, and pulled even with Carlos and Marie. Harper tightened her arms around Wyatt's waist. He patted her hands, then shouted at Carlos. "You call it!" Carlos didn't hesitate. "Go!" His sled took off. An instant later, the front skis of their machine lifted from the ground as they ripped off after them. Harper crouched down, hiding her body behind Wyatt's. The large plastic windshield provided a windbreak, but she didn't want to contribute any drag that might slow them down. Even in the daylight, the snow-covered landscape all looked the same. In the moonlight, it was almost impossible to differentiate between straight and hilly terrain. With her head behind Wyatt, she felt, more than saw, the changes in the trail. His body tensed and leaned, and she moved with him, bouncing over bumps and careening around turns. The wind whipped around them, and snow flew up and over the windshield, blowing in short gusts. Harper held tighter to Wyatt. She couldn't see the taillight of Carlos's machine. Once, Wyatt glanced around. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she shouted. "We've got a fouled plug. We're not catching Carlos, but we might be able to beat the other two." She had no idea what a fouled plug was. However, she understood there was a problem, but the competitor in Wyatt couldn't quit. They traveled on in silence for a while, the only sound the revving of their motor. They were going too fast for her to enjoy the night ride, but Harper still cherished the hardness of Wyatt's torso, The way his energy seemed to channel into her, and the way it seemed like they were alone on the planet, together. A light cut across her shoulder, and she twisted enough to see a machine coming up on their left. Wyatt leaned forward fractionally, and she imitated his movement. For a few moments it seemed like they might pull ahead, but the trail straightened and the other sleds slowly gained on them. Harper squinted over at it. Steve, she was pretty sure. As they bore gradually left around a sloping curve, he pulled ahead. Still, Wyatt didn't quit, and Harper was reminded of the tortoise and the hare. There was always the possibility of something going wrong, so it would be foolish to quit until the end. Steve was barely by them when again a headlight shone over Harper's shoulder. Dim at first, it got steadily brighter. They had reached the part of the trail that twisted and turned into a narrow ribbon. Not enough room for the sled behind them to pass. The headlight moved from their right side to their left, like the machine behind them couldn't wait to get an opportunity to pass. Ahead, the reflector that indicated the crevice Wyatt had shown her earlier on their way up blinked in the light of their headlight. Harper's chest tightened. Her heart thumped against her ribs. She realized she was holding her breath. Wyatt eased off on the throttle just a little. The sled behind them seized the opportunity, slipping out from behind them and pushing around. The crevice grew closer, the shiny reflector the only indication of its presence. He began to ease to the left, following the trail, which curved then narrowed. Beside them, Kayla drew even, then nudged ahead. The proximity of her machine did not allow them to turn as sharply as Harper thought they needed to. She leaned, expecting to turn. Both sleds continued straight. The reflector was mere yards away. Harper closed her eyes and concentrated on the feel of Wyatt. She didn't believe that he would drive off the trail, but she'd said she trusted him. She needed to prove it. Kayla fishtailed, then bore left, speeding around the curve and out of sight. Wyatt turned the handlebars, but the sled did not turn. Were they on ice? Harper's entire body froze in terror as the reflector careened toward them. A scream built in the back of her throat, but Harper swallowed it. The analytical side of her brain didn't want Wyatt to die with her terrified scream being the last thing he ever heard. His body leaned left, way out over the side of the sled. "Lean!" he shouted. She was already behind him, out over the frozen snow, her face mere inches from the ground. Their machine plowed over the reflector. The skis seemed to grip as the front end turned left. The back fishtailed right. Harper's body pressed into Wyatt's back as the sled slowed. She kept her upper body poised out over the side of the sled. Snow flew everywhere, big clouds of white that obscured the hole that gaped, bottomless and black, nearby. The front right side of the sled tipped. Harper gasped. She gripped Wyatt's waist with all her might. Her stomach felt like it was going to come flying out of her mouth at any second. Still hanging over the side of the snowmobile, Wyatt pushed back. The sled stopped. The motor died. Harper held her breath. The front right ski hung suspended over the edge of the crevice. The sled dipped down. It rocked back and forth like Satan swinging a baby's cradle from one finger. She could almost hear the evil laugh echoing up from the pits of hell where, surely, this crevice led. She still leaned to the left beside Wyatt, but, just moving her eyes and lifting her head a fraction, she could look to the right and see there was nothing there. The snowmobile sat on the very edge of the precipice, except the one ski which didn't. "Get off the sled, Harper," Wyatt said low but very calmly. She opened her mouth to argue. She wasn't getting off while he stayed on. She wasn't leaving him. But this was his gig. She wasn't going to start now thinking that she knew better than he did. At least, not about something like this. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. Not with her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth the way it was. "Slowly," he said in that same low, calm voice, like talking might shift the weight of the sled and cause it to tip down, like a ship sinking to the depths of the ocean. She unclenched her fingers from around Wyatt's waist. Stiff and frozen in place from the force of which she'd been gripping, they didn't want to move. The sled rocked gently as she slid her arms slowly back. "Harper?" She couldn't risk trying to say more. A scream, blood-curdling and agonizing, crouched just at the back of her throat. So close, the slightest effort to open her mouth might allow it to get loose. She was afraid that, once she started, she wouldn't be able to stop. Not in this lifetime, which could end up being very short. "You know I love you." "Shut up," she said. Not mean, but firm. He wasn't going to get all mushy-gushy on her now. To do so meant that he was acknowledging the fact that they might not make it. If he did that, she'd lose it. She scooted back a little more. The sled rocked. A clump of snow broke off the edge with a muted crack and fell silently into the earth. On the other hand, "I love you too." He'd probably think she meant friend love, the love he'd been talking about. He didn't need to know it wasn't that kind of love. She'd heard that as a person is about to die, their thoughts became clearer, and maybe that was true, because it was obvious there was a very fine line between love and hate. She wanted to beat Wyatt, but she also wanted to kiss him, long and hard and just as thoroughly. "You slide back too." "I'm not moving until you're off." He stopped talking as the sled rocked. "If this thing starts to go, dive left." She didn't answer. The drive to save herself was strong, but she wasn't sure she could jump while Wyatt rode the machine to his death. Her butt touched the back end of the seat. "I'd rather we survive this together." "I love it when we agree." "If you even crack one joke—" "What? You'll push me?" "I can't make dying jokes right now." Harper carefully lifted her butt and settled on the very back of the snowmobile. It seemed more stable now. "I'd rather die laughing than die scared." "We disagree on that one, because I would rather not die at all." "See? Brain trumps brawn." Gingerly lifting her leg, she swung it over. She grabbed the back rest, which was just a bar that went up, over, and down. "I'm sitting on the very back edge, holding on to the handle. If it goes, all I have to do is stand up. You slide back now." Wyatt didn't argue. He tucked his legs back and slid, slowly and steadily back until his back touched Harper's leg. "You get up, and I'll follow you." "Let's do it together on the count of 3. Rather than answering, Wyatt started counting. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 19. Wyatt brought his arm around Harper, pushing her off in front of him. After taking a good 5 or 6 steps, they stopped and turned. The sled wobbled, but stayed on the edge. Adrenaline buzzed through Harper's body. making her feel like she could run back to the lodge, or back to Pennsylvania, which seemed like a haven of safety right now. After a high like that, she was cognizant enough to know that the emotional and physical crash would be huge. She wanted to get back to the lodge and preferably be in bed when her body came down, since it was probably going to involve an ugly cry, a lot of shaking, and the fetal position. Wyatt didn't seem to be affected. Harper tried to pretend casual.
I can't believe Kayla didn't stop.
She looked around. Blue-white, moon-washed terrain as far as she could see in all directions. She didn't even see any lights which could be from the lodge or ski resort. They'll be back when we don't pull in. Wyatt put both hands on his hips. But I think I can pull that baby away from the edge. I'm not sure why it shut off.
Because you scared the crap out of it.
Wyatt snorted. Same thing happened to me.
Fooled me.
His head snapped around, and he seemed to search into her soul. I was scared. Trust me. She believed him. She spoke softly.
I've done nothing but trust you lately.
Something seemed to flash on his face, and she thought he was going to step toward her. Did his hand move toward her face? But his expression cleared and he muttered, "Thanks." He turned back to the snowmobile. "Stay back here." He glanced over at her, maybe to make sure she heard him. "Sometimes with crevices, there'll be a buildup of snow along the opening, like there's snow maybe 4 or 5 feet deep around the top, but nothing under it to support it. Know what I'm saying?"
I'm just thanking God I didn't know that 5 minutes ago.
The very idea made her want to pee her pants. She took another step back.
I'd feel more comfortable if you'd step back here with me.
I will. He flashed her his practiced grin. She put her hands on her hips.
That one doesn't work on me. Remember, this is Harper, not some floozy you met on the slopes.
He looked over his shoulder and raised a brow. Believe me, Pickles, I know who I'm with.
Well, then you should remember that smile hasn't worked on me since you used it to convince me to bungee jump out of the maple tree.
She pressed her lips together. I visited you in the hospital. He spoke without looking back at her. She rolled her eyes and huffed.
That's because you were there with me.
That was 10 years ago. I can't believe you're still holding that against me.
You might as well figure it out now that there are certain things a girl doesn't forget.
Like almost dying. You forget nothing, Wyatt replied with a smile in his voice.
I'm not going to forget that Kayla tried to run us into that crevice, then booked it out of here.
He shook his head. She didn't do it on purpose. She wanted to win as bad as I did. Harper was not convinced of that, but she kept her mouth shut. If Wyatt were out of the picture, Kayla would not have any competition for inheriting the resort. Maybe she'd read too many murder mysteries, because Wyatt didn't seem the slightest bit worried. He stepped forward. Before she could clamp her teeth around them, words spilled out.
Please be careful.
Maybe it was her tone, more than the actual words, that caused him to pause, mid-stride, and slowly look back. A muscle bunched in his jaw. I will. Their eyes held for a second that stretched like eternity. Emotions roiled in Harper's chest, but neither of them said anything more. Then Wyatt turned back around and walked carefully toward the snowmobile. Grabbing the back handle, he spread his feet wide, planting them to the side and behind the machine. Then, gathering himself, he pulled. Nothing happened at first. Harper just prayed that the snow beneath his feet wouldn't suddenly give way. There could not be anything worse than seeing Wyatt disappear downward in a cloud of dusty snow. She had no idea what she'd do if that happened. Run for help, jump in after him, dissolve into a pile of incoherent muck. Yeah, definitely. She banished those thoughts from her head. For now. They would come back to haunt her tonight, she was sure. As Wyatt exerted steady pressure, the snowmobile began to move. At first, she thought it was her imagination, it happened so slowly. But then, inch by terrible inch, it came back. Until suddenly, it broke free. Wyatt scrambled backward, dragging the sled. The thin shelf of snow that had supported it, and them earlier, broke free, tumbling down into nothingness. Harper gasped and her hand went to her throat, as though it would be able to keep her heart from ripping out of her chest. The momentum carried Wyatt and the machine back to solid ground. He bent over, panting. Harper closed her eyes and breathed deeply, thankful that the drama seemed to be at an end, and both Wyatt and she, and their snowmobile, were all safe. She walked over and put a hand on Wyatt's back.
You okay?
It wasn't like him to not bounce back immediately. Yeah, I just realized as the shelf was giving way that me dropping out of sight would be traumatizing to you. It hit me kind of hard. He straightened. I'm sorry. She laughed, shaky.
That's what you're sorry for? Almost traumatizing me?
She shook her head.
What about the other 1,000 things that have happened in the last 15 minutes that actually have traumatized me?
I guess I just figured me dying would be the worst.
You're right.
She snapped and regretted her tone immediately. Reaction.
I'm sorry. I think I'd really like to get back to the lodge so I can curl up in bed and pull the covers over my head for a while.
You're gonna have to fight me for them.
I thought we were fighting about who got to sleep on the floor. I let you win.
Let's see if we can get this beast started. We can fight about the covers 15 minutes from now. He leaned over the machine, brushing snow off the controls and apparently checking for leaks, before he adjusted the run button and yanked on the pull rope. The engine sputtered but didn't catch. Wyatt adjusted the choke. It fired right up on the second pull. Your chariot, ma'am. Harper was afraid she might need hard liquor and a tranquilizer more than a chariot, but she'd already snapped at him, and she didn't want him to think she blamed him for their near deaths. She wasn't sure she could say the same about Kayla, and, right now, she wanted to blame someone. Maybe tomorrow, after the fright and adrenaline wore off, she'd be more reasonable. Currently, her body had already started to shake, and her knees barely held her up. She climbed on behind Wyatt. If he noticed that she held on tighter and pressed her body against his more fully, he didn't say anything. He held the throttle and handlebars with one hand, placing the other over her hands, which squeezed his stomach. As his gloved fingers curled around hers, tingles spread up her arm and tears pricked her eyes. All these crazy, uncontrollable emotions swirled through her body, but for now she could chalk them up to the fact that she and her best friend had almost died. Heat from his back scalded her front, but rather than pulling away, she pressed closer, wishing her helmet away. She had the unreasonable urge to bite his shoulder. They'd only been riding for a few minutes when headlights popped up coming toward them. I knew they'd be back for us. She didn't say anything, not even wanting to try to understand the competitive spirit that would lead someone to race away from a potential catastrophe. Wyatt stopped, and the snowmobile with Steve and Kayla on it stopped alongside. It looked like Carlos and Marie on a machine behind them. "You guys just that slow? Or did you stop to make out?" Steve called over the growl of the engines. "Just slow." Harper was amazed at Wyatt's calm. She was not that relaxed. "Kayla said she lost you by the crevice."
"If you went in, I knew I wouldn't be able to get you out by myself."
She lifted the coiled rope from her shoulder. That was almost reasonable, but she should have stopped to see, just in case. Wyatt just jerked his head in acknowledgement. "I appreciate you coming back out for me. Sorry you wasted your time." "I'd expect the same from you," Steve said. "You'd get it," Wyatt answered. His hand squeezed hers where it still rested against his stomach. "Harper and I have had enough excitement for one day. We're heading back to the lodge and bed. You park your machine by the back door. We'll see that it gets put away." "I appreciate it, man." Wyatt thumbed the gas, and the sled took off. Harper shook so badly she could hardly keep herself still. "You gonna make it, Pickles?"
"What else could I do?"
By far, this had been the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Wyatt glanced back, his face relaxed, his eyes sparkling, his lips split in a wide smile. Her lips tilted up in response. They'd almost died, but he was smiling and getting her to grin back at him. She was still dealing with the after effects of the excitement, but because of Wyatt's confidence and humor, the danger they had been in seemed to fade. Not that she wanted to go back and do it again, just that a sudden, warm, bubbling joy filled her chest. They were alive. They'd tempted death and won. Euphoria coursed through her body. This had to be the high that adrenaline junkies sought. She could see why. She felt invincible. She wanted to stand up on the back of the snowmobile with her arms raised in the wind. Even that did not seem like a big enough outlet for the emotions that pounded through her body, swelling her chest, straining up her neck and making her arms and legs feel energized and capable of winning an Ironman competition. Life couldn't get any better. Sometimes life sucked. Wyatt parked the snowmobile at the back door and helped Harper off. She was still shaking, but she bravely gave him a humongous smile. Probably because she knew how butt-awful he felt about almost killing her. He threw a hand up as the others rumbled by. Steve stopped his machine and Kayla hopped off, jumping on to his. He appreciated them taking care of it so that he could get Harper inside, but he didn't stop to chat. He still couldn't believe how close she'd come to death tonight. Because of him and his overzealous, continuous quest for adventure, she had every right to hate him. He almost wished she would. He'd welcome punishment for what he'd done. Maybe it would appease some of the guilt and shame that curdled his blood and shriveled his heart from putting the woman he loved and should have been protecting in danger. If there was one thing that tonight showed him very clearly, it was that every time Harper was with him, she ended up in danger or hurt. Tonight, maybe she hadn't gotten hurt, but she'd almost died. He was a fool to think for 1 second he was any good for her. Only a matter of inches, and tonight could have turned out so much differently. It was crazy to think that Harper belonged with him. If he were smart, if he really loved her, He'd get as far away from her as possible, for her own safety. He took Harper's hand. In the state he was in, he figured it would serve him right if he ruined their friendship by allowing her to know his feelings for her. That would almost be a fitting punishment. He didn't deserve her, especially after tonight, and he wouldn't allow himself to try to get her to see him as something more than her step-cousin. So he held her hand, which, somehow, remained soft and trusting in his. The kitchen was dark and quiet when he let her in. The small light above the stove bathed the room in long shadows. It should feel homey to him. After all, he'd spent more time in this kitchen than in almost any other place in the world. But it didn't bring the calmness, didn't make him feel like he'd walked into a close, loving family, the way being in the old farmhouse on the tree farm in Pennsylvania did. Still, nothing was out of place. It almost seemed wrong, after such a life-threatening adventure, feeling as miserable as he did, to walk into the kitchen and have it look exactly the same as it always had. Harper's hand tightened around his. He looked over his shoulder. "Hungry?" She laughed and rolled her eyes.
No, you probably are.
He was, actually. She tried to tug her hand free.
Stay here and grab something. I'm going to take a shower and snuggle under the covers. Try to relax.
He stopped and turned around to face her, keeping hold of her hand. "I really am sorry." Her hand came up to his face, holding his cheek in a soft caress. It felt like forgiveness, and he leaned his head into it, closing his eyes.
When I'm with you, I know you're thinking about me before anything else. I can't lie and say I wasn't scared.
Her hand trembled against his face.
But I knew if there was a way out, you'd find it. Don't apologize.
I've always enjoyed the rush of danger and the euphoria of conquering death, but I absolutely did not enjoy the fear I felt tonight when you were in danger. It made me think, is that what everyone else feels about me? Her eyes widened.
Yes.
She stepped closer. Wyatt's heart hit against his chest like it was reaching out to her.
That's exactly how I feel. And when you were climbing that mountain last winter, when you were in the Amazon with no cell phone service for weeks, if I thought about it, I wouldn't be able to function.
She placed a hand over his chest where his heart beat for her. His breath came shallow and fast, and his brain had all but shut down. Vaguely, he remembered there were reasons he couldn't get this close to Harper, why he couldn't put his arm around her waist and draw her to him, but he couldn't remember, didn't want to remember. Her body touched his. He put his other hand around her neck, threading it under her hair, tilting her head up. "Stay away from me. Stay away so I don't hurt you, drag you into danger. I couldn't stand it if anything happened to you." Her lips parted, and her tongue touched one corner of her mouth. Pulses, like electric shocks, ripped through him. Her breath hit his face, and her hand slid around to hold the back of his head. Her other hand slid around his waist, slipping under his shirt, shocking his bare skin. His breath came out in a rush, and he lowered his head. All thoughts of anything except taking her lips with his evaporated out of his mind. He'd dreamed of this for so long. He'd almost lost her today, but she was alive, safe and warm in his arms. her body pressed to his. 2 hearts, 1 heartbeat. Harper, He didn't finish the whispered plea, unsure if he had meant to ask permission, apologize, or maybe even give her the chance to back away. The distance between their lips vanished, and they were pressed together. Hers were soft and pliant and warm. It was almost enough, and not even close to being enough. Behind his closed eyelids, hot red and yellow sparks erupted. He pressed his lips tight together, determined not to give rein to the passion and need ripping through his soul. But she sighed and twisted her head slightly. The friction as their lips moved over each other burst in his head, and the beast inside, the one that caused him to climb mountains, race too fast, and ride dangerous rapids, roared to life. His mouth opened, and he caught her sigh, took it in, tasted it, savored it because it was Harper's. He growled, pressing her to him, lifting her against him. His tongue plunged into her mouth, and the kiss he'd dreamed about for years became reality. Her hand gripped his head, pulling him closer. Her mouth opened under his. Her tongue dueled with his. Her arms wrapped around him, and he pressed her against the wall, his hands roaming freely down her sides and through her hair, like he couldn't get close enough, couldn't touch her enough, couldn't feel her enough. He groaned, frustrated he couldn't get closer, needing the reaffirmation of life after her brush with death. But he was going too fast. Vaguely, he realized it. He pulled back, some part of him afraid that she'd come to her senses and slap his face. But she had kissed him back. He was sure of it. Unable to bear the idea of letting her go, he leaned back and looked into her eyes. Harper's breath came in heavy pants. She forced her eyes open and met Wyatt's gaze, hoping he didn't misread the wide-eyed wonder in hers. Nothing in her relationship with Wyatt had prepared her for her body's reaction to his kiss. Hoping she wasn't being presumptuous, she whispered, "More." Wyatt's eyes lowered. His head drifted toward hers. His hand moved slowly and lightly up and down the curve of her waist. His other hand traced slow circles on the back of her neck. The passionate haze that had enveloped her settled more closely around, fogging her brain, narrowing her thoughts down to just one focus: Wyatt. His lips on hers, his hands, his body, the beat of his heart, the scent of him, rich and spicy, natural. His head moved to the side. She held back a whimper of frustration, which changed to a purr of contentment when he kissed the corner of her eye, the edge of her jaw, just beside her lip. His stubble rubbed slightly against her sensitive skin, and she remembered earlier that she'd wanted to bite him. The urge came back, powerfully. She clamped it down. This was a gentle kiss, a romantic kiss. He kissed the tip of her nose, then her other cheek. Her hands moved to his face, and she caught his cheeks between them. "My lips, Wyatt. You can kiss your sister on the nose." "I don't know why in the frig I'd want to," Wyatt murmured. She smiled, and he smiled, their gazes connecting just before their lips touched. Gently, sweetly, light butterfly touches that drove sensation through her body, settling in her stomach. The kiss was delicate and mild, until it wasn't. Unsure how it happened, Harper realized her body strained against his, and her hands clutched his shoulders. He crushed her closer. She clung to him, and their mouths were deeply, intimately joined together. "Wyatt!" Kayla shouted, impatience clear in her voice. Harper came far enough out of the passion fog to realize that it wasn't the first time she'd said his name. Wyatt's head lifted. She almost doubled over from frustration and disappointment. Who would have guessed that kissing Wyatt would be so consuming? Sure, he was extremely handsome with a great physique, but whoa, she had never dreamed that there might be so much passion between them, which couldn't be a good thing since they were just friends. She wanted more kissing, and more than just friends. His arms loosened slightly. She allowed her hands to drop. He cleared his throat. "What?" "I need to talk to you." "Talk?" Kayla didn't say anything. As much as Harper didn't want to leave the circle of Wyatt's arms, she understood what the silence meant. She swallowed, trying to tamp down the heat and stop the racing of her heart. "I want to get a shower and head to bed anyway." She couldn't bring herself to look at Wyatt while she spoke. Maybe she was afraid that she wouldn't see the same powerful emotions that rioted inside her reflected in his face. That would be devastating. Maybe this didn't mean as much to him, and maybe it didn't change anything for him. For her, it had been life-changing. She moved. Wyatt's hands tightened on her waist, and she stopped without looking at him. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and she realized she was holding her breath. "I'll be back shortly," he said in a scratchy voice. Maybe he said that for Kayla's benefit. It didn't matter. If she reminded herself of that often enough, she might be able to believe it. Forcing a smile, she looked up. "I'm first back, so I get to pick my spot." Kayla wouldn't know Harper was referring to the ongoing competition Wyatt and she had about who was sleeping on the floor. Chuckling a little at the thought, she watched Wyatt's eyes crinkle. The concern in them faded away. "I might have to eject you." Wyatt winked at her. His hands loosened, and she walked away. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.